1912, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In the dead of night, the air around the mines seemed to thicken, pressing against the lungs of anyone daring enough to approach. Miners whispered of shadows that moved where no torch could reach, fleeting figures that vanished the moment someone tried to confront them. The Lancaster mines were no ordinary tunnels. They were an underground labyrinth, carved into the earth over decades, stretching farther than any map could chart. A place where light fought to exist, and reason faltered at every turn. Men disappeared without a trace, their tools left abandoned, boots half buried in the mud, lanterns flickering and then dying inexplicably. Families arrived at the mine entrances hoping for explanations, only to find silence. Or worse, eerie echoes of the missing men calling back in distorted voices. Some townsfolk whispered that the mines themselves were alive, conscious in a way that could detect trespass, punishing the greedy and the unwary. Others blamed simple human failings, negligence, collapsing shafts, or methane explosions, the predictable hazards of life underground. Yet the patterns were inexplicable. Certain sections of the mine claimed more victims than others, and survivors spoke of unseen forces that seemed to guide the accidents. Witnesses described walls that seemed to breathe, shadows that lingered too long, and voices that mimicked the cries of men long gone. In these accounts, innocence collided violently with the inexplicable. Hard-working fathers, sons, and brothers entering the mines expecting only coal and profit found themselves caught in a web that blurred natural law with something far older, something darker. Historical records and newspaper clippings documented the disappearances with clinical detachment, but behind the sterile reports lay a town in terror, its collective imagination haunted by unexplained loss. Even in daylight, the mine entrances exuded an aura of menace. Locals avoided certain paths, claiming the air carried whispers that only children and the sensitive could hear. Miners reported feeling watched, a sensation that intensified in the deeper tunnels where darkness was absolute. Moral questions arose alongside the fear. Were these deaths merely the cost of industrial progress? Or was human curiosity trespassing on something sacred and forbidden? Psychological undercurrents, the trauma of loss, guilt of survival, and the shared dread, infected the town, creating a narrative that no single explanation could resolve. This introduction sets the stage for an exploration of the Lancaster mines, establishing the tension between fact and folklore, rationality and superstition, innocence and malevolence. As the audience confronts the first disappearances, they are invited to question everything they know about safety, history, and the limits of human understanding. Were these men victims of accident, malice, or an entity older than the earth itself? Perhaps the mines kept their secrets deliberately, or perhaps the truth slipped silently beneath the ground with those who vanished, leaving only echoes and the lingering suspicion that some darkness in Lancaster was not meant to be uncovered. The Lancaster mines were never simply coal pits. They were veins running through centuries of layered history, each tunnel a thread connecting past and present, human ambition and forces beyond comprehension. When construction began in 1883, the town's leaders boasted of economic promise, of coal enough to power Lancaster and beyond. Yet beneath their optimism lurked land that had long been whispered about in local folklore. Long before miners arrived with picks and lamps, Native American tribes had marked the area as sacred, a place where the earth's pulse could be felt beneath the soil, and where spirits, protectors of the land, warned against intrusion. Early settlers had documented strange occurrences, livestock found trembling without cause, sudden storms forming above the hills, and travelers vanishing near the ridge where the mines would later spread. The tension between industrial ambition and ancient warning set the stage for the events that would haunt Lancaster for decades, a collision of logic and legend, greed and reverence. The miners themselves were a mix of hopeful immigrants and local laborers, drawn by steady pay and the promise of work. Yet even as they descended into the tunnels, some expressed unease. Diaries from the first foreman noted the eerie stillness of certain shafts, the way shadows seemed to cling to walls long after lanterns had passed. Overseers' letters spoke of pride in progress but also an inexplicable anxiety, as though the mines themselves observed every swing of the pickaxe. These men, practical and often skeptical of superstition, could not fully rationalize the sounds of distant whispers echoing through passages, the collapses that seemed too coincidental, or glimpses of movement just beyond the torchlight. Some dismissed these phenomena as imagination run wild, a product of fatigue, darkness, and the monotony of repetitive labor. Others, however, began to suspect that the land they dug into held more than coal. perhaps a memory of those who had come before, perhaps an anger awakened by disruption. Folklore surrounding the site was abundant and persistent. Local elders recounted tales of colonial-era settlers who had buried valuables and secrets in the hills, their remains intertwined with curses designed to protect what was sacred. Some stories told of Native American spirits, guardians who would punish anyone attempting to desecrate the land, of shadows that could follow men from ridge to ridge, of sudden collapses that claimed entire crews. While these accounts were dismissed by most scholars as superstition, patterns began to emerge as miners reported hearing voices in unoccupied tunnels, of tools vanishing only to appear in places they could not have been moved, and of entire sections of the mine collapsing without cause. The convergence of folklore and inexplicable incidents created a psychological landscape just as perilous as the physical one, a subtle terror that made the earth itself seem alive, aware, and vengeful. Economic pressure only heightened these dangers. The late 19th century was an era of rapid industrial expansion, and coal was king. Miners were pushed into deeper and more unstable tunnels, often ignoring warning signs in pursuit of profit. Psychological studies today suggest that greed and ambition can amplify risk perception, and in Lancaster, this human factor intertwined with supernatural suggestion in ways that were almost symbiotic. Men who might have hesitated in isolation pressed forward collectively, the drive for economic gain overriding instinctive caution. Reports from the period hint at near misses, collapses narrowly avoided, and workers whose fears manifested as hallucinations, visions of figures in the darkness warning them to leave. These were not mere accidents. They were harbingers, signs that the land itself demanded acknowledgement, though the miners were largely unwilling or unable to recognize it. Early correspondence from overseers reflects this uneasy duality. On one page, they boast of record-breaking yields, of tunnels extending for miles, of coal quality that promised to place Lancaster on the industrial map. On the next, they confess strange occurrences. Footsteps heard where no one walked, unexplained cold drafts, and the faint impression of being watched. Journals of miners, written in cramped handwriting on nights by lantern light, recount sounds that could not be explained by natural phenomena. Low moans that resonated through tunnels, sudden shivers that moved down the spine even in warm air, and flickering lights that mimicked human figures. Some entries describe fleeting visions, men whose faces were pale and hollow, who disappeared the instant someone tried to approach, or shadowy forms that seemed to merge with the stone walls. The juxtaposition of ambition and fear set the psychological groundwork for what would come next, creating a culture where rationality clashed with the unexplained at every turn. The physical geography of the mines contributed to the unease. The tunnels were narrow, uneven, and labyrinthine, with shafts that dropped into darkness and ventilation systems that sometimes carried sound in unnatural ways. Methane pockets and unstable seams created real hazards, yet the pattern of incidents suggested something more. Certain areas were disproportionately dangerous, claiming multiple workers while neighboring shafts remained relatively safe. Survivors from early shifts noted an almost deliberate quality to the disappearances, a sense that the mine had favorites, certain men being spared while others were inexplicably claimed. Whether coincidence or consciousness, the psychological effect on those who remained was profound. Fear compounded itself, creating an environment where the imagination blurred with reality, and where stories of ghosts and spirits spread alongside reports of tangible accidents. As the mines expanded deeper into the hills, this tension intensified. Workers who had initially scoffed at superstition began to discuss the mines in hushed tones, sharing accounts of shadows, fleeting voices, and inexplicable chills. Ethical questions emerged alongside practical concerns. Was it right to pursue profit at the expense of human life, and could the land itself demand a form of justice beyond human comprehension? Early historians and psychologists analyzing the era note that when rational explanation fails to account for repeated incidents, humans often create narratives to reconcile fear and observation. In Lancaster, these narratives intertwined with tangible events, forging a legend that would shape the town's collective consciousness and prime it for the tragedies to come. The mine's history also reveals the interplay between human hubris and inherited caution. While folklore warned of danger, economic and social pressures demanded disregard. Miners entered the tunnels expecting labor and reward, often ignoring instinct and local advice. Some accounts suggest that those who respected the warnings fared better, noticing unusual signs and retreating from areas others considered routine. This interplay, Intuition versus ambition, caution versus hubris, laid the foundation for subsequent disappearances. The very act of mining became a moral and psychological trial, where every decision carried consequences, not only for life and death, but for the town's understanding of the boundary between the natural and supernatural. By the late 1890s, reports of strange occurrences in the Lancaster mines had escalated, though documentation remained inconsistent. Letters, diaries, and newspaper articles hint at a growing awareness that something in these tunnels was more than mere earth and coal. Some passages were avoided entirely by seasoned miners, and the community began to whisper that the land itself remembered every transgression. Shadows in tunnels were no longer dismissed as tricks of light. Voices and footsteps became interpreted as warnings or omens. The tension between human rationality and the supernatural suggestion of the land created a cultural context in which disappearances were not only possible, but almost inevitable. This section transitions naturally toward the first disappearances, introducing the audience to a world where history, psychology, and folklore collide. The Lancaster mine's origins were a perfect storm of ambition, greed, sacred ground, and psychological strain. The stage was set. Men descending into tunnels not merely of stone and coal but of fear, superstition, and forces they could neither see nor fully comprehend. Were these early miners victims of accidents, poor planning, or something far older, waiting silently for their intrusion? The story of the Lancaster mine's origins establishes that the darkness beneath Lancaster was never accidental. It was inherited, pervasive and patient, biding its time until men's ambition would lead them into its grasp. The history of the mines is thus inseparable from the legend of disappearances, a collision of human striving and the ancient unknowable world beneath their feet. By 1902, Lancaster had begun to feel the first real tremors of a nightmare few could articulate but everyone sensed. The town's mines, once a source of pride and economic promise, became a place of dread as men who entered the tunnels seemingly vanished into thin air. It began subtly, almost innocuously, with a miner failing to return from a routine inspection trip. His lamp was found resting on a support beam, still warm, his pick leaning against the wall. No footprints led away, no collapsed shaft explained his disappearance. Families, desperate and trembling, pleaded for explanations from mine overseers, only to encounter bureaucratic silence, dismissive reports, or vague promises of investigations that never materialized. Rumors spread faster than any official statement. Shadows moved unnaturally, tools rearranged themselves, and distant whispers carried through tunnels where no one walked. Innocent men, fathers, husbands, and sons, were vanishing, leaving the town gripped by an emotional turmoil that blurred reason and fear. Each disappearance carried not only the loss of a life, but the slow erosion of collective trust, as the line between accident and malevolence grew ever thinner. The early disappearances were often dismissed by outsiders as tragic accidents, yet for those living on the edge of the mines, the events seemed deliberate, almost sentient. Miners who had worked decades without incident suddenly found themselves hesitant, their instincts screaming caution they did not understand. The stories of these missing men, John Harper, who vanished on February 3rd while inspecting the northern shaft, Samuel Klein, whose pick and helmet were discovered 30 feet from the tunnel's mouth, and young Thomas Evers, gone while assisting a senior miner with measurements, served as the first undeniable signs that something was profoundly wrong. Witnesses reported that after the vanishings, a lingering sense of presence haunted the tunnels. Some described whispers that were intelligible yet faint, calling the names of the lost miners, echoing along the stone walls. Others claimed to see shadows detach themselves from the rock and drift through passageways, only to dissolve when approached. The pattern was inconsistent, yet undeniably eerie. Disappearances clustered in specific shafts, often in older, less stable parts of the mine. No purely rational explanation accounted for the frequency or selectivity of these events, fueling both superstition and terror. Families endured psychological torment as the mine swallowed their loved ones without trace. Mothers cried themselves to sleep at night, imagining the fate of sons who had left for a day's work but never returned. Wives clung to fading hope, while communities formed informal search parties, descending into the labyrinth with ropes, lanterns, and trembling courage. Yet the mines resisted every attempt at rescue, twisting paths and concealing evidence. As the psychological strain intensified, patterns emerged among the remaining miners. Paranoia took root, fear metastasized, and collective hysteria began to shape daily life. Work slowed, productivity dropped, and whispered warnings dominated conversations. The townsfolk were caught between rational skepticism, knowing the mind's dangers, and the compelling evidence of the inexplicable, creating an environment where fear could spread unchecked. Eyewitness accounts of strange phenomena added layers of unease. Tools that had been carefully placed on support beams were found in completely different locations hours later, despite no one entering those areas. Lanterns flickered with no discernible cause, sometimes illuminating figures at the edge of visibility, only for the figures to vanish when examined directly. Shadows lingered too long, moving against the light, creating the unsettling sensation that the miners were being observed by an intelligence not human. The phenomenon was not uniform. Some shafts remained relatively quiet, while others seemed almost cursed, claiming more lives than could be explained by collapse or gas alone. Psychologists analyzing similar patterns in modern industrial disasters have identified a mix of heightened stress, fatigue, and perceptual distortions, yet the intensity of Lancaster's report suggested a presence that the human mind could scarcely interpret. The tension between natural explanation and the possibility of malevolent interference fed both the town's fear and the growing legend of the mines. Specific cases illustrate the chilling scope of these early incidents. On March 19, 1902, miner Eli Freeman entered a western shaft to inspect a suspected gas leak. His boots were later found neatly aligned by a tunnel wall. His lamp rested atop a wooden beam, glowing faintly, but no trace of him remained. Witnesses who accompanied rescue teams described hearing faint singing, unlike any song known locally, echoing through the tunnels, only to disappear when they attempted to follow it. Another disappearance involved the Harrow brothers, twins who entered a northern gallery to deliver supplies and never returned. Their belongings were found stacked neatly, as if arranged for presentation rather than abandoned in haste. Local miners swore that shadows of two figures had been seen drifting in the corridor the previous night, though the accounts were dismissed by skeptics. In each instance, the community was confronted with the impossibility of the events, deepening psychological trauma while laying the foundation for enduring myth. The emotional impact on the town cannot be overstated. Children grew fearful of their fathers' workplaces, and wives often refused to speak of the men who did not return. Social gatherings carried an undertone of whispered dread. Humor and laughter became scarce, replaced by speculation and anxiety. This psychological strain, in combination with repeated disappearances, created fertile ground for legend. Historians and psychologists suggest that when a community experiences repeated unexplained tragedies, folklore evolves to provide structure to the chaos. In Lancaster, the collective imagination filled gaps left by incomplete records and official obfuscation, producing stories of entities, curses, and prescient warnings. The narrative shifted from pure accident to moral and supernatural interpretation, allowing the town to make sense of the impossible, even if only partially. Some survivors offered testimony that blurred the lines between reality and terror. Miners who returned from the deeper tunnels described sensations of being watched, of hearing their names whispered in voices they did not recognize. One miner, Peter Lang, claimed to have felt his own footsteps mimicked as though someone, or something, was walking just behind him, keeping pace. Another, Joseph Mahoney, spoke of sudden chills that froze his limbs despite warm air, and lights that flickered to reveal shapes darting just beyond vision. These reports, while anecdotal, were consistent enough to suggest a pervasive phenomenon within the mines themselves. Psychologists analyzing similar historical cases emphasize the role of trauma, collective hysteria, and environmental stress. But Lancaster's events resisted simple categorization. The disappearances and supernatural claims intertwined, creating a psychological feedback loop in which fear itself seemed to influence outcomes. Rational explanations were attempted. Engineers surveyed shafts for structural failure. Geologists tested for gas pockets, and safety inspectors introduced new protocols. Methane explosions and collapsing tunnels accounted for some disappearances, but far too many cases defied scientific reasoning. Patterns suggested intentional avoidance of certain areas by miners, almost as though the tunnels themselves dictated behavior. Attempts to reconcile these anomalies with fact only amplified tension. Locals argued that science ignored warnings etched into the land, while rational authorities dismissed folklore outright. This tension between evidence and belief underscored the larger narrative of the Lancaster mines, highlighting a fundamental struggle between human reasoning and forces, or patterns, beyond comprehension. By the end of 1902, the first victims had set the tone for decades of tragedy. Names like Harper, Klein, Freeman, and the Harrow brothers became etched into community memory, serving as cautionary figures. The disappearances were no longer isolated events. They were part of a growing pattern that would haunt families, workers, and historians alike. The mines had revealed themselves as more than geological formations. They were a psychological crucible, a place where innocence collided with incomprehensible malevolence, and where fear became both survival mechanism and narrative force. The stage was set for escalating horror, as the town grappled with the knowledge that every descent into the tunnels carried not just risk, but a confrontation with the unknown. The tension between innocence and evil, fact and legend, rationality and superstition, created a psychological environment that would dominate Lancaster's history. By detailing specific cases with dates, names, and eyewitness accounts, the narrative draws the audience into a personal, intimate engagement with the mystery. Viewers are invited to question the nature of the disappearances. Did the mine claim these men literally, or did paranoia, fear, and collective hysteria magnify tragedies into legend? The first victims of Lancaster were not only lost underground, they became catalysts for a story that would blend reality and myth, logic and terror, leaving an enduring imprint on the community's psyche and priming the narrative for rational investigation and supernatural speculation alike. The Lancaster mines had become a riddle, a dark puzzle that no amount of engineering or reason could fully solve. By the early 1900s, the disappearances had drawn the attention of journalists, engineers, and psychologists, all determined to uncover the truth. Engineers surveyed the tunnels with meticulous precision, measuring shaft stability, ventilation, and gas levels. They documented collapses, pockets of methane, and toxic gases capable of inducing dizziness, hallucinations, or sudden unconsciousness. These hazards accounted for some accidents, yet inexplicably many men disappeared without trace, as if the tunnels themselves had claimed them. Scientists dismissed the folklore that clung to the mines, arguing that shadows and whispers were products of fear and poor lighting. Yet the locals, miners, and townspeople alike refused to accept such cold rationalization. They insisted that something older, something beyond human comprehension had taken hold of the mines. The tension between scientific evidence and superstition was palpable, creating a narrative where logic and legend collided with each passing incident. The psychology of fear played a central role in understanding the mind's grip on human perception. Modern analysis suggests that the combination of isolation, darkness, and repeated exposure to unexplained events can magnify stress, producing hallucinations or heightened sensory awareness. In Lancaster, confirmation bias and mass hysteria intertwined with tangible dangers, creating an environment in which every creak, shadow, or flicker of light could be interpreted as evidence of the supernatural. Miners, already wary after months of disappearances, began to see patterns in random events. A falling rock became an omen, a shifting shadow became a stalking figure, a whisper carried meaning that may not have existed. The human brain's drive to find order in chaos intensified the fear, embedding it into collective memory. Even rational observers could not entirely separate fact from perception. The mind under stress became as treacherous as the mine itself. Journalists visiting Lancaster documented these phenomena in ways that blended objectivity with subtle suggestion. Reports detailed strange lights deep within abandoned shafts, appearing as glowing orbs or flickering lanterns where no miner had ventured. Unnatural cold spots, sudden gusts of wind, and echoes of footsteps were recorded with painstaking care, each account straining credulity, yet consistently reported by multiple witnesses. Religious interpretations further complicated the narrative. Some townsfolk spoke of curses laid by displaced Native Americans, of divine punishment for desecrating sacred ground. Priests were called to bless tunnels, yet reports persisted that the disappearances continued even after ritual intervention. These conflicting explanations created an atmosphere where truth and belief overlapped, leaving room for multiple interpretations. Rational investigation coexisted uneasily with fear, superstition, and faith, heightening suspense and deepening the mystery of the Lancaster mines. Attempts to analyze the mines scientifically were meticulous yet incomplete. Engineers charted every shaft, measured structural integrity, and examined the chemical composition of the surrounding rock. They identified pockets of methane capable of causing sudden explosions, and areas where coal dust could ignite without warning. Structural collapses explained some disappearances, yet too many cases remained unresolved. Miners were found missing in areas that had been thoroughly mapped and deemed safe, their lamps extinguished, personal effects abandoned, and no evidence of collapse present. Geologists speculated that unseen fissures or subterranean voids might account for certain incidents, but these theories could not explain the reported whispers, moving shadows, or inexplicable chills described by survivors. Science could rationalize the physical dangers of the mines, but it could not account for the pervasive psychological and emotional terror that haunted those who remained. Folklore, by contrast, provided narrative coherence where science faltered. Tales of shadowy figures, protective spirits, and ancient curses circulated widely among miners and townsfolk. A miner might enter a tunnel alone, and later report feeling watched by an invisible presence, or hearing voices calling his name from corridors that had been empty for hours. Such accounts, while dismissed by scientists, persisted and multiplied, shaping the town's collective consciousness. Even skeptics could not ignore the consistency of reports, as multiple miners independently described similar phenomena in locations that varied only slightly. This interplay between anecdote and fact created a unique tension. Folklore offered explanation and comfort. Even as it intensified fear, miners were simultaneously rational and superstitious, navigating the thin line between understanding and terror. Psychologists analyzing the events note the role of trauma and collective anxiety. Witnesses described an ever-present dread, a tension that seemed to vibrate through the tunnels themselves. Miners spoke of shadows that followed their movements, tools that shifted inexplicably, and cold spots that froze limbs in warm air. Such experiences could be dismissed as environmental anomalies amplified by fear, yet the psychological impact was undeniable. Families of the missing endured prolonged uncertainty, exacerbating anxiety within the community. As these patterns persisted, the town developed a shared narrative that merged fact, speculation, and legend. Fear became both explanation and consequence, shaping the environment as much as coal dust or structural hazards. Eyewitness accounts of lights, unearthly voices, and shadowy figures challenged the limits of rational explanation. Miners reported seeing lanterns floating in empty corridors, illuminating walls that should have been solid rock. Voices called warnings or names with tones that were unmistakably human, yet impossible to locate. Shadows moved in ways that defied physics, stretching along walls or dissolving when approached. These phenomena, documented repeatedly, forced investigators to confront the possibility that perception, environment, and perhaps something beyond, converged in the minds. The tension between scientific inquiry and supernatural interpretation intensified as each new report emerged. Rationality suggested fatigue, optical illusions, and environmental anomalies. Superstition proposed conscious malevolent forces at work. The audience is drawn into a debate without resolution. Were these experiences psychological manifestations of fear, natural events misinterpreted, or glimpses into the inexplicable? The friction between science and superstition also manifested in social interactions. Engineers and inspectors entering the mines often found miners reluctant to follow maps or scientific guidelines, citing intuition, spiritual warnings, or prior experience. Conflicts arose between rational authority and localized knowledge, each side convinced of its own understanding. Supervisors reported that even when protocols were followed, strange occurrences persisted, undermining confidence in engineering expertise. Miners who relied solely on superstition risked accidents, yet those who relied solely on science reported unexplained sensations of being observed or touched, or hearing noises that defied explanation. The psychological environment created a self-reinforcing loop. Fear heightened perception, perception reinforced superstition, and superstition undermined rational action. Religious interpretations further deepened the narrative. Priests and local spiritual leaders attempted to bless the tunnels, sprinkling holy water and offering prayers intended to ward off malevolent forces. Miners reported that some disappearances seemed to pause temporarily after blessings, only for them to resume without warning. Stories circulated of apparitions, faint chants, and shadows that appeared to respect ritual spaces while ignoring others. Science could not account for these experiences, yet for the miners and townspeople, they reinforced the sense that forces beyond comprehension operated in the tunnels. Rationality and belief collided in a way that amplified tension, creating a setting where uncertainty itself became a tool of terror. Journalists chronicling the events played a subtle but important role. Articles published in Lancaster newspapers documented disappearances, strange phenomena, and community fear with a mix of detachment and intrigue. Some reports emphasized rational causes, methane pockets, unstable tunnels, human error. Others highlighted folklore, providing readers with chilling accounts of shadows, whispers, and inexplicable cold. These accounts reached far beyond the town, framing Lancaster as a place where the limits of understanding were tested daily. By juxtaposing rational investigation with local superstition, journalists reinforced both the mystery and the credibility of reported phenomena. The tension between fact and legend became central to the narrative, drawing the public into debate and speculation. As the body of evidence grew, the narrative shifted from individual disappearances to systemic mystery. Investigators noted patterns. Some tunnels were disproportionately dangerous, certain shifts experienced more anomalies, and inexplicable incidents occurred even in well-ventilated, structurally sound areas. Miners' accounts were cross-referenced and patterns emerged in reports of lights, sounds, and shadow movements. Psychology, folklore, and science collided. Each provided partial explanations, but none accounted for the totality of events. Rational explanations addressed the physical dangers. Superstition addressed the inexplicable. Together, they created a layered understanding that both fascinated and terrified the community. By the end of this period, the Lancaster mines had become a case study in the limits of human understanding. Science could map tunnels, measure gases, and document collapses, but it could not account for shadows, voices, or the sense of being observed. Superstition explained anomalies, but could not prevent tragedies. The audience is invited to dwell in this tension, questioning whether phenomena were psychological, natural, or truly supernatural. The stage is set for the next chapter. Survivors' testimonies that provide intimate human perspectives, complicating any singular interpretation and forcing a confrontation with both the tangible and the unimaginable. The Lancaster mines had claimed many lives, yet a few miners emerged, forever changed, bearing stories that blurred the lines between reality, perception, and something darker. These survivors, once pragmatic, hard-working men, carried with them the psychological residue of experiences that defied explanation. Their accounts range from hallucinations triggered by fear and exhaustion to encounters with entities described as human-like yet impossibly tall, or invisible forces that seemed to manipulate tunnels and air currents, actively preventing escape. Even decades later, their memories were vivid, imbued with the sense that the mines themselves had an intelligence, aware of every movement, every sound, every breath. Some described the oppressive weight of the air, as if the tunnels themselves pressed down upon them, while others spoke of sudden cold spots, inexplicable gusts of wind, and shadows that seemed to stretch, detach, and move independently of any light source. Each narrative, unique yet consistent with others, highlighted not just survival, but the profound psychological impact of confronting something wholly unknown. One of the earliest survivors, Peter Lang, recounted descending into the Northern Gallery in 1903 during a routine supply trip. He described a sensation of being followed, hearing footsteps perfectly synchronized with his own. Yet when he turned, the tunnels appeared empty. Lantern light revealed shifting shadows that moved faster than any human could, bending around corners with impossible agility. Lang noted a coldness that seeped through boots and gloves, chilling him to the marrow, accompanied by whispers calling his name in voices both familiar and alien. Each element, the movement of shadows, the temperature changes, the auditory hallucinations, was not isolated but experienced simultaneously, producing a sense of unreality that haunted him for decades. His recollections emphasized a psychological truth: extreme stress, isolation, and environmental hazards amplify fear, creating perceptions that blend memory, trauma, and something that cannot easily be rationalized. Other survivors offered equally disturbing testimonies. Joseph Mahoney, who emerged from the western shafts after 3 hours of searching for missing equipment, described encountering a presence that seemed to block passage. He recounted an unseen force moving behind him, diverting him from safe routes, forcing him deeper into labyrinthine tunnels. Mahoney recalled an internal struggle, fear urging flight, logic urging retracement, yet an invisible barrier dictating the path. The miners' formerly rational minds, trained to navigate complex networks of rock and timber, found themselves powerless. His account underscores a recurring theme in survivor narratives: the juxtaposition of methodical knowledge and irrational terror, where expertise provided no shield against the anomalies they encountered. These moments of helplessness created long-lasting psychological scars, amplifying guilt, anxiety, and obsession. The moral dilemmas faced by survivors compounded their trauma. Choices made in moments of fear often involved life-and-death decisions: abandoning injured colleagues to save oneself, navigating unstable shafts that threatened collapse, and making instantaneous judgments without full knowledge of consequences. One miner, Eli Freeman, recounted leaving a friend behind during a sudden methane leak, a decision that weighed on him for years. Survivor narratives reveal the complexity of human ethics under extreme stress, where moral intuition, survival instinct, and environmental hazards collide. These dilemmas became recurring motifs in the psychological legacy of the mines, contributing to community legend and personal torment. Survivors often carried these burdens in silence, haunted not only by what they saw but by the choices they made in the tunnel's unforgiving darkness. Beyond the psychological trauma, survivors reported sensory anomalies that further confounded rational explanation. Many described the sensation of being watched, of eyes tracking movements in the dark, even when no living presence was visible. Sounds of footsteps, whispers, or soft murmurs echoed in tunnels devoid of other humans. Some reported physical effects, sudden headaches, nausea, and vertigo upon exiting certain passages. These sensations were consistent across multiple independent testimonies, suggesting either a powerful environmental effect or encounters with something beyond human perception. Shadowy figures appeared in peripheral vision, sometimes vanishing when focused on, while lights flickered in impossible patterns. Such accounts challenge conventional understanding of perception, memory, and reality, demanding consideration of both psychological and potentially anomalous explanations. Survivors' narratives also highlight the subjective nature of memory under extreme duress. Recollections often included vivid cinematic imagery, walls breathing, rock faces warping, tunnels elongating or shifting. While some psychologists argue that these are manifestations of stress-induced hallucinations, the consistency of details across multiple accounts suggests a pattern that is difficult to dismiss. In addition, temporal distortions were reported. Minutes felt like hours and distances seemed to stretch impossibly, leaving miners disoriented. These cognitive anomalies contributed to the narrative of the mines as living entities, capable of manipulating perception and instilling dread. Such descriptions laid the foundation for myth-making, as personal horror evolved into communal legend, each retelling reinforcing the mine's reputation as a sentient, malevolent force. Community response to survivors' accounts further shaped the legend. Miners returned to their families with stories that blended terror and survival, often retold in hushed tones to children and neighbors. As these narratives circulated, embellishment and interpretation amplified fear, blurring boundaries between first-hand experience and folklore. A miner's fleeting hallucination became a cautionary tale, a warning of a tunnel's danger or evidence of a curse. Survivors' testimonies became cultural currency, guiding behavior in the mines and shaping collective understanding of risk, morality, and the unknown. The interplay between personal experience and communal storytelling ensured that the mine's psychological impact extended far beyond those who entered them, embedding fear into the town's psyche for generations. Dark psychology provides insight into these experiences. Extreme stress, isolation, and repeated exposure to danger can distort perception, memory, and decision-making. Survivor narratives reflect this. What might have been minor hallucinations or fleeting shadows became monumental, life-altering events. Cognitive biases, confirmation of pre-existing fears, and heightened sensory awareness amplified their interpretation of events. Miners entering the tunnels were predisposed to anticipate danger. The environment provided stimuli, echoes, drafts, flickering light, that validated these fears. In this context, personal horror merges seamlessly with environmental factors, creating a potent psychological experience that persists in memory long after physical escape. One particularly haunting account comes from Thomas Evers, a young miner who survived an inspection trip in 1904. Evers described being trapped in a narrow shaft while shadows flickered along the walls, moving independently of any light source. He recounted hearing a chorus of whispers, each distinct, some mocking, some commanding, all urging him deeper into the tunnel. Attempting to retrace his path, he found hallways rearranged, stairways misaligned, and familiar markers absent. This cognitive distortion, whether hallucination or anomalous phenomenon, left Evers convinced that the mine itself was testing him, aware of his movements, and perhaps even judging his worthiness. Such testimonies underscore the psychological complexity of surviving the mines. Perception, morality, and fear became intertwined, producing narratives that are simultaneously plausible and terrifying. The survivors' accounts also reveal long-term psychological consequences. Many men developed chronic anxiety, sleep disturbances, and paranoia, often revisiting the tunnels in dreams or hallucinations. Some spoke of being haunted by shadows and voices long after leaving the mines, while others were plagued by survivors' guilt, replaying moral decisions repeatedly in their minds. Communities adapted around these traumas, incorporating the legends into everyday life, creating a collective memory of horror that reinforced behavioral caution. These narratives illustrate the intersection of individual trauma, environmental stress, and cultural myth-making, demonstrating how personal horror can evolve into communal legend. The detailed recollections of sound, light, temperature, and spatial distortion contributed to the growing mythology. Miners described walls that seemed to pulse, lights that bent unnaturally, and drafts that carried messages in indistinct whispers. Some survivors felt invisible hands or pressure guiding or blocking their movement, while others experienced temporal distortions, with minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Such accounts, consistent across multiple individuals, challenge the boundary between psychological interpretation and potential anomalous events. The combination of trauma, perception, and environmental influence created a narrative that was compelling, terrifying, and nearly impossible to debunk entirely. Ultimately, the survivors' stories bridge the tangible and the inexplicable. By juxtaposing their previously rational, pragmatic personalities with experiences that defied logic, the narratives illustrate the psychological impact of extreme stress, isolation, and perceived supernatural threat. Moral dilemmas, sensory anomalies, and environmental hazards intertwine, producing accounts that are both deeply human and unsettlingly mysterious. These testimonies form a critical link between fact, folklore, and legend, preparing the audience to engage with subsequent theories, speculations, and unresolved truths. The personal horrors of the mines became the scaffolding for communal mythology, ensuring that the Lancaster mines remained a site of fascination, fear, and enduring mystery. As the decades passed, Lancaster's disappearing miners became the seed for countless theories and myths, each attempting to reconcile the unexplainable events within the mines with human understanding. Initially, historians and engineers pointed to structural instability, methane pockets, and coal dust explosions as the most plausible causes. Collapses, suffocation, and accidental falls offered rational explanations for some of the early vanishings. Yet as the pattern of disappearances continued, and survivors returned with stories of shadows, whispers, and unseen forces, purely scientific accounts began to feel insufficient. Gradually, folklore and superstition asserted themselves alongside rational inquiry, forming a tapestry of narratives that juxtaposed fact against imagination, reason against fear. Ancient curses, purportedly originating from displaced Native American tribes or colonial-era settlers, became part of the discussion. These stories suggested that the land itself retained memory and agency, punishing those who violated its hidden sanctity. Miners, townspeople, and historians alike debated whether these narratives were symbolic, psychological, or literal truths. Theories of malevolence extended beyond folklore, incorporating allegations of governmental or corporate cover-ups. Some believed that mine owners, seeking to maintain profit and public image, concealed the true number of casualties. Records were incomplete, obfuscated, or destroyed, fueling suspicion that the disappearances were manipulated or hidden from the public. Journalists uncovered instances of missing personnel that were downplayed as accidents, while survivor testimonies suggested anomalies that defied explanation. Psychologists interpreted these cover-up narratives as expressions of collective anxiety. Communities under stress often externalize threats, projecting unseen dangers onto powerful institutions. Yet the persistent gaps in official records left room for genuine speculation, allowing conspiratorial theories to intertwine with more fantastical explanations. The tension between institutional authority and local experience heightened the sense of uncertainty, reinforcing the mine's reputation as a locus of inexplicable danger. Locals whispered of even darker possibilities. Among the most chilling were rumors of satanic rituals, secret gatherings held within the deepest shafts, and ceremonies intended to harness or appease unseen forces. Though evidence was anecdotal at best, these accounts thrived in an environment saturated with fear and legend. Shadowy figures glimpsed in peripheral vision, sounds of chanting or rhythmic pounding, and sudden environmental changes were cited as proof that something deliberate and malicious operated below the surface. These narratives served as cautionary tales, blending morality with terror. Men who entered the mines not only faced physical hazards, but risked confronting moral and spiritual corruption. Historians and rational investigators largely dismiss these tales, yet their persistence illustrates the power of myth to fill gaps left by incomplete evidence. As with other explanations, the interplay between fear, perception, and narrative reinforced the mystique surrounding the Lancaster mines. Recurring motifs emerged consistently across stories and accounts, forming a recognizable pattern that fueled myth-making. Missing men, inexplicable shadows, whispers from empty corridors, and sudden environmental changes became central symbols in local lore. Each motif carried psychological weight. Shadows represented the unknown, whispers evoked the sense of unseen presence, and disappearances embodied human vulnerability. In some cases, patterns overlapped with moral or religious symbolism. Miners who ignored warnings or acted selfishly were more frequently reported as missing, suggesting an allegorical dimension to the narrative. Folklorists studying the phenomenon note that such motifs are common in communities experiencing repeated, inexplicable loss, serving both as mnemonic devices and as mechanisms for conveying communal values, fears, and ethics. The myths of Lancaster, though terrifying, are therefore also deeply human. They articulate the struggle to understand and survive in the presence of uncertainty. Debates among historians, psychotherapists, and paranormal enthusiasts further enrich the landscape of interpretation. Academics examine structural reports, mining logs, and survivor testimonies, seeking patterns explainable through logic and environmental science. Psychologists analyzed collective trauma, cognitive bias, and the influence of isolation on perception, emphasizing that extreme stress could magnify ordinary phenomena into the extraordinary. Paranormal investigators, by contrast, highlighted the recurring accounts of shadows, voices, and anomalous light, suggesting that the mines were a nexus of unexplained energy or consciousness. These competing perspectives created a dialogue in which no single interpretation dominated. Instead, the Lancaster mines became a crucible of human curiosity and fear, illustrating the tension between evidence and speculation. Audiences are invited to weigh these interpretations themselves, questioning whether phenomena were purely psychological, environmental, or truly anomalous. The myths of Lancaster also extended beyond the town, hinting at connections to other mysterious disappearances worldwide. Scholars have drawn parallels between the mines and cases in other industrial or natural environments, where workers vanished under unexplained circumstances. From abandoned European mines to remote Siberian shafts, reports describe similar motifs. Shadowy figures, inexplicable sounds, and sudden disappearances with no clear cause. Such correlations suggest that the Lancaster mines may be part of a broader, global pattern of human encounters, with environments that provoke fear, disorientation, or perception of the unknown. While skeptics argue these parallels are coincidental, the repetition of narrative elements across cultures and geographies invites deeper consideration. Are these phenomena universal expressions of human psychology under extreme conditions, or do they point to a darker, interconnected reality that transcends cultural boundaries? Religious and spiritual interpretations continued to intersect with these theories. Some argued that the mines were cursed, or that the disappearances were divine punishment for moral transgressions, greed, or desecration of sacred ground. Clergy invoked prayer and ritual to protect workers, and some survivors credited spiritual intervention with their escape. Yet, as disappearances persisted despite blessings and ceremonies, the tension between faith and outcome became evident. The coexistence of religious interpretation with rational and folkloric explanations reinforced the complex narrative framework surrounding the mines. No single worldview could account for all observed phenomena. This layering of perspectives created a fertile environment for myth-making, blending human morality, psychological stress, and environmental hazard into a singular narrative that remained compelling and terrifying. Patterns of moral caution became central to the enduring legends. Miners who ignored warnings, acted selfishly, or attempted to exploit the tunnels recklessly were disproportionately featured in stories of disappearance. Shadows, whispers, and unseen forces were interpreted as responses to moral failings, reinforcing an ethical dimension to the mythology. This moralization is consistent with global folklore patterns, where unexplained events are often codified as lessons about hubris, greed, or disobedience. In Lancaster, the intersection of morality, environmental risk, and superstition created stories that were psychologically satisfying, culturally resonant, and enduring. The myths transformed the mines from a site of industrial labor into a moral and metaphysical landscape, where the consequences of action were amplified by fear, legend, and perception. Public fascination further shaped the evolution of these theories and myths. Journalists, writers, and visitors were drawn to Lancaster, chronicling the mines with a mixture of documentation and sensationalism. Articles combined factual reports of disappearances with anecdotes of shadows, whispers, and inexplicable phenomena, ensuring that the narrative reached audiences far beyond the town. Psychologists argue that such exposure reinforces fear and myth-making, as external interest validates and amplifies local experience. Paranormal enthusiasts embraced the legend, conducting expeditions and producing narratives that emphasize the uncanny, while rationalists attempted to ground the story in technical analysis and environmental hazard assessment. The tension between competing interpretations became part of the spectacle itself, demonstrating that the Lancaster mine's mystery thrived as much in perception and discourse as in physical reality. Ultimately, the theories and myths surrounding Lancaster are inseparable from the human desire to explain the inexplicable. Scientific, folkloric, religious, and conspiratorial narratives coexist, overlapping and intersecting, each providing partial insight but no complete resolution. Shadow, disappearance, and whisper remain central motifs, guiding interpretation while resisting definitive explanation. The audience is left to consider whether these events were accidents amplified by stress, psychological manifestations of collective anxiety, or encounters with forces that elude current understanding. By framing the narrative through competing interpretations, the Lancaster mines become a mirror for human curiosity, fear, and the enduring need to find meaning in chaos. In the end, Lancaster's legends are open-ended, a tapestry of fact, speculation, and imagination woven across decades. The disappearances, the shadows, the unexplained sounds, and the moral dilemmas remain unresolved, resisting closure. Historians, psychologists, journalists, and locals continue to debate, providing perspectives that are equally compelling, yet incomplete. The myths endure not because of definitive evidence, but because they speak to universal human experiences: fear of the unknown, vulnerability to unseen forces, and the struggle to reconcile morality, rationality, and survival. The audience is left suspended, encouraged to speculate, debate, and question, their imagination filling the gaps left by history, psychology, and superstition. Lancaster's mines remain a locus of terror, legend, and fascination, a story that refuses to conclude. The Lancaster mines remain an enduring enigma, a place where shadows stretch beyond the reach of reason, and whispers echo through corridors long sealed by time and stone. Official records document hundreds of men lost within the labyrinthine tunnels, yet these documents offer only fragments, incomplete narratives that fail to capture the full scope of terror. Survivor testimonies, already filtered through trauma and decades of memory, blend seamlessly with folklore, anecdote, and speculation, creating a narrative where fact and legend are inseparable. Perhaps the disappearances were tragic accidents born of human error, structural instability, or environmental hazards. Yet, the consistency of accounts describing shadowy figures, disembodied voices, sudden chills, and inexplicable guidance suggests that something beyond the ordinary may have been at play. Some insist the truth perished with the missing men, swallowed by darkness and obscured by bureaucratic silence. Others argue that the mines themselves remain alive, waiting silently beneath Lancaster, patient, intelligent, and perhaps malevolent, ready to confront the next unwary visitor. Local residents continue to whisper of signs that the underground world is far from inert. Lanterns flicker inexplicably along sealed shafts, and faint cries echo through layers of rock long closed to human passage. Miners' descendants claim that dreams of lost relatives returning from the depths are common, dreams so vivid that waking life seems porous, as if the boundary between surface and subterranean has thinned. Historians, journalists, and paranormal enthusiasts alike debate whether these phenomena are real or products of imagination fueled by collective memory and fear. What is undeniable is the enduring psychological and cultural imprint of the mines. They serve as a stark reminder that human rationality is often inadequate when confronted with environments that resist comprehension. Greed, neglect, and ambition may have set the stage, but whether they explain everything is impossible to determine. The Lancaster mines are thus left suspended in perpetual uncertainty, a locus where multiple truths intersect without resolving. Shadows of the past persist, mingling with moral caution, folklore, scientific analysis, and psychological horror. Every whispered story, every historical anomaly, and every surviving memory contributes to a narrative that refuses closure. The audience is forced to confront the tension between what can be explained and what cannot, to weigh human error against potential malevolence, and to wonder if some truths are destined to remain out of reach. Perhaps the darkness waits still, patient, invisible, and intelligent, a test of curiosity, courage, or folly. The story closes not with certainty but with haunting questions. Was it greed, human neglect, or fate that claimed so many? Or is there a force older, darker, and unknowable, lurking beneath the quiet town of Lancaster waiting for its next witness? The minds are sealed, yet the mystery endures, beckoning the audience to speculate, debate, and dwell within its shadows long after the final word.